Alright, Chapter 8 Solutions. Number 1. Which of the following pertains primarily to the planning of fixed overhead costs? The answer is D. Key decisions are made at the start of the budget period or well in advance of the budget period, determining the level of the cost for those fixed overhead types of items. Number 2, in selecting a cost allocation base for our variable overhead, what criteria for the base is preferred? B, a cause and effect relationship between the cost and the activity level is the best. Alright, for questions 3 through 10, it's a little involved. If you want to, take a moment, pause the video and read through the scenario that is listed here down up to these bullet points right here. I will go ahead and read it quickly though for those who may be listening to this while they're doing something else. So Sebastian Company, which manufactures electrical switches, uses a standard cost system and carries all inventories at standard. The standard manufacturing overhead cost per switch are based on direct labor hours and are shown below. Now I want you guys to consider the fact that they took the total amount estimated for variable overhead cost for the year and they divided it by the total number of direct labor hours that would be calculated for the year. And that total direct labor hours for the year is going to be based on the budgeted amount of units to be produced and sold times the standard direct labor hours allowed. Okay, so their variable overhead is 5 hours per unit, and that's direct labor hours at $12 per direct manufacturing labor hour for a total of $60. And then their fixed overhead, 5 hours again, at $15 per direct manufacturing labor hour for a total of $75. Therefore, based on that information, if you add the two of those together, you've got a total overhead per switch, because each switch takes 5 hours to produce, equals $135 per switch. Now, this information is based on capacity of 200,000 direct manufacturing labor hours per month. And I will come back to this information in some of the problems that we're going to work below. Alright, the following information is available for the month of December, which is the month we're going to be looking at, and we're going to be calculating variances based on the actual results versus budgeted information for this particular month out of an entire year's worth of data. Alright, so 46,000 switches were produced, although 40,000 switches were scheduled to be produced. Alright, so 46,000 was our actual quantity of switches produced, where originally, when our master static budget was put together, only 40,000 switches were scheduled or budgeted. 225,000 direct manufacturing labor hours were worked. Okay, so that's our actual labor hours, 225,000 total were worked, with a total cost of $5,625,000. Therefore, that $5,625,000 is our total cost for those labor hours. Variable manufacturing overhead costs were $2,750,000. That is our actual amount for our variable manufacturing overhead cost, and then our fixed manufacturing overhead costs were a total of $3,050,000. Again, that is our actual fixed manufacturing overhead cost. Alright, so if we scroll down and we look at question number 3, they want us to calculate the variable overhead spending variance. Alright, so how do we do that? I've written out here 2 different ways for you guys to look at it. Actual cost versus actual hours times budgeted rate per unit. Actual hours was 225,000, and our actual rate was whatever the actual rate was. Those 2 numbers could be multiplied together to give us the $2,750,000 that was listed right here for our actual cost for variable manufacturing overhead. Now, this needs to be compared to our actual hours times our budgeted rate per unit. Alright, so again, we're still using actual hours of 225,000, and we're going to multiply that times our budgeted rate. So our budgeted rate for variable overhead was calculated and given up here in the top, and we're using $12 per direct manufacturing labor hour. So the budgeted rate is 12. Multiplying that times the actual hours would have given us $2,700,000. Alright, so this number right here would be showing up in the actual overhead flex. Alright, so the difference between the $2,750,000 actually spent versus the actual hours times the budgeted rate would give us the difference in the spending. Alright, so we're talking about $50,000 spending variance. We spent $50,000 more than what we would have expected using our standard rate. One other way to look at this is going to be comparing the actual rate minus the budgeted rate and then multiplying those times the actual hours. So we've seen now that mathematically speaking, there's a couple of ways of solving these, okay? Alright, so that was number 3. Let's scroll down here and look at number 4. Alright, so number 4, they want us to calculate the variable manufacturing overhead efficiency variance for December. Alright, so what we're going to be looking at is taking actual hours at the budgeted rate and comparing that value against the budgeted hours allowed for the actual units produced times the budgeted rate. Alright, so we're using the budgeted rate is the same on both sides. We are now looking at efficiency. Did we use more or less hours than what we would have expected? Alright, so our actual hours is 225,000 times that $12 budgeted rate for variable overhead. We would calculate 2.7 versus budgeted hours allowed times the budgeted rate. Alright, so 46,000 units were actually produced at 5 hours each allowed times the budgeted rate of $12 per hour for the variable overhead would give us $2,760,000. Alright, so we are talking a $60,000 difference, and it's favorable. Right? Another way of looking at it is doing it this way. Actual direct labor hours utilized, 225,000 versus how many would have been allowed? So 46,000 switches times 5 hours each would have allowed for 230,000. So we did it in 5,000 less hours than what management expected, times $12 an hour for our budgeted variable overhead rate. Again, 60,000 favorable. Number 5, they want us to calculate the total variable manufacturing overhead variance. Right? They're wanting us to look at only variable manufacturing overhead variance. Therefore, what can we do? We can go and look at all of the variances that we have calculated just in regards to variable manufacturing overhead. Alright, so we can go back up to our problems that we've just worked through, and what we're talking about is just the flexible budget variance just for manufacturing overhead, the variable manufacturing overhead. So all we're going to do is add up or net together our unfavorable by 50 grand spending variance, and we're going to net that against our $60,000 favorable efficiency variance, and therefore we've got a $10,000 favorable variance just related to our variable manufacturing overhead. If you have to, pull out that chart or another handout that I'm going to load up for you guys that has a lot of formulas and stuff on it, and look at these things visually laid out and see how I have put this calculation together. Alright, number 6, variable overhead. We are now looking at the fixed manufacturing overhead, and we're going to look strictly at the overhead spending variance related to fixed. Alright, so if we were to go back up and look at some of the information that they gave us, we're going to pull out pieces of that. Here they gave us fixed overhead, 5 hours allowed per unit based on so many units per year. They calculated out $15 per direct manufacturing labor hour. Alright, total that out, they expected to spend $75 per unit produced. Now, they based this on capacity of 200,000 direct manufacturing labor hours per month. Okay, so let's go and put the formula back together to figure out how they came up with this $15 per hour. Alright? $15 per hour based on a capacity of 200,000 hours per month means that if we multiplied that out, then they expected fixed overhead per month to be $3 million. Alright? Therefore, where would this $3 million in fixed overhead be put in our master static budget? The master static budget would show fixed overhead as $3 million. And then recall that I said that when we put that flexible budget together, that fixed overhead number should not change. It should remain the same in total. So the fixed overhead column, the flexible budget column should show the same exact number, $3 million for fixed overhead. Alright, so let's figure out what the spending variance is. The spending variance when it comes to fixed overhead is just the difference between what was originally budgeted and what was actually spent. Okay, so $3 million is what would have been budgeted, but the actual fixed overhead per the details that they gave us farther up in the page was $3,050,000. Therefore, we have spent $50,000 more than we planned on, and that's an unfavorable spending variance for fixed overhead of $50,000 unfavorable. Number 7, they want us to calculate out the fixed overhead production volume variance. Alright, now this one is a little bit different how we go about looking at this. Alright, we can do it one of two ways. I do want you guys to recall that in the data set we had 46,000 switches were produced, although only 40,000 switches were scheduled. Alright, so when we did our calculations to come up with our fixed overhead per unit based on X number of hours allowed each, we calculated that based off of 40,000 switches. But as we go about producing these, we are going to be allocating based on the allowed hours and our actual rate that we have calculated in our budget. Alright, so our budgeted direct labor hours is 200,000 hours per month. But again, this number right here was based off of 40,000 switches. We actually produced 46,000 units, and each time one of those was produced, we would have allocated in cost, and we would have been using 5 hours allowed per unit. So 230,000 hours would have been allocated at a rate of $15 per hour. But we've got a difference here between what was budgeted and what was allocated to the tune of 30,000 hours. 30,000 more hours were allocated than what was original in our master static budget. Alright, so that means 30,000 hours at $15 per hour, we have over allocated to the tune of $450,000, which is favorable. Here's another way of looking at it. I've spelled it out in numbers. 200,000 hours at $15 an hour means $3 million is what would have shown up as fixed overhead in both the flexible column and the master static column. But what has been allocated is in a whole nother column all by its little self. Alright, so 46,000 actual units at 5 hours allowed times the $15 budgeted or standard rate that we've calculated equals 3,450,000 would have been allocated in for that. 3,450,000 versus 3 million is 450,000 over allocated. Alright, so it's a favorable amount versus what was budgeted. So our fixed overhead production volume variance is 450,000 favorable. Let's look at number 8. They want us to answer what amount should be credited to the allocated manufacturing overhead control account. Alright, so our manufacturing overhead control account, we will be taking for each unit produced, we're going to multiply it times 5 hours allowed, which equals 230,000 hours allowed. And that 230,000 hours allowed would be multiplied times those budgeted rates. Those budgeted rates for fixed overhead and those budgeted rates for the variable overhead. Okay, so 15 an hour and 12 an hour equals 27 an hour. 27 an hour times that 230,000 hours means we would have allocated $6,210,000. Number 9, they want us to look at what our flexible budget variance would be for December. If you were to pull up the handout or go and look at our chart, the flexible budget variance is made up of 3 components when we're talking about just our overhead items. Alright, you can can go back up through some of our numbers from farther up, and you can see that in question number 3, we calculated the spending variance for variable overhead, which was $50,000 unfavorable. We want to net that with our efficiency variance for variable overhead that we calculated in number 4. Those two things were the flexible budget variance related to variable overhead. And then we want to net those with the flexible budget variance for our fixed overhead. And our flexible budget variance for our fixed overhead is equal to our spending variance for fixed overhead. Alright, we calculated that in number 6. And that one was $50,000 unfavorable. So let's net a $50,000 unfavorable, another $50,000 unfavorable against a $60,000 favorable, and we get an unfavorable total flexible budget variance related to all of our overhead at $40,000 unfavorable. Number 10, they want us to just calculate just the spending variance, okay? And that is the total of the spending variance for variable overhead netted with the spending variance of the fixed overhead. Both of those, again, calculated farther up above. We've got $50,000 unfavorable for the spending variance for our variable overhead, and then we've got a $50,000 unfavorable spending variance for our fixed, for a total of $100,000 unfavorable spending variance. For number 11, which of the following statements is true about overhead cost variance analysis? Using activity-based costing, we can still perform a for-variance analysis when we use activity-based costing, just like we can for our standard costing. And then number 12, which of the following is an example of a non-manufacturing cost that may be analyzed using variances? We can go and look at product distribution costs. Recall that in Chapter 7 and 8 we have seen that example of the airline industries and some items that they go in and look at. Again, we can use this variance analysis technique to analyze other types of companies' services. It doesn't have to be a manufacturing company, okay? One other key way you guys could have eliminated these other 3 answers here is factory rent is definitely a manufacturing cost, indirect labor is also a manufacturing cost, and factory supplies are also a manufacturing cost. Okay, so the one that definitely stands out there is product distribution costs. Alright, that's the end of the ICPs for Chapter 8. I will post you guys some additional information regarding these chapters and the test over these chapters, so be looking for those.